First want to say welcome. Thank you all for coming to this summer seminar and specifically the PERVADE conversation with Dr. Sacoby Wilson. I'm Katie Shilton and I'm a principal investigator on the PERVADE project. And the PERVADE project is a 6-institution research project that's focused on answering empirical questions in big data ethics. It's funded by the US National Science Foundation. And we're studying how people react to their pervasive digital data being used in research, how data scientists are grappling with ethical questions in their work, and how regulators such as university institutional review boards are guiding data-intensive research. And this webinar series that we're holding this summer and hopefully into the fall highlights a number of researchers who are doing cutting-edge work using data from people in data science, data ethics. And so today I'm joined by Dr. Sacoby Wilson, who's an associate professor at the University of Maryland College Park School of Public Health, so another TERP, and he directs the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health, CEEJH. So Sacoby, thank you so much for being here, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, really pleased. So to get started, I wondered if you would tell us more about the work of the UMD Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health.
Yeah, so the center, we primarily do work to engage communities in science using community science frameworks. So community-based participatory research, which is really making sure the communities engage in all stages of the research process, grounded in Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the press. So making sure those who are most impacted, that their voices are heard in science. Since I do environmental justice work, really focus on trying to use science to empower communities. So not e-empower, because and explain that e-empower is giving people power. We do I-empower to make sure people access the power they already have. And so that builds off the 17 principles of environmental justice. And those principles are really the foundation for doing environmental justice work. It's part of the social movement. And principles 5 and principle 7 really talk about communities speaking with their own voice and self-determination. And so that's where empowerment science comes from. So we really focus on empowerment science, and we also focus on liberation science. So we want to liberate communities from toxic exposures, environmental hazards, sacrifice zones. So the goal is to do science that actually leads to real action. And we're not doing science that's extractive. We're not trying to do science that's helicopter. We're not just doing knowledge production. A lot of the work that I see when it comes to these issues in the US and historically in the US when it comes to science, we have this idea of dispassionate scientists who just collects data. I mean, that's a stereotype. But unfortunately, the communities that I deal with and work with, they don't have time for people to study in problems. Problematizing without solutions is very much colonial exploitation-based science. And we're not in the business of doing that kind of science.
Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of data then that community members collect as part of community-based environmental justice projects? I know you've had a wide variety of projects as diverse as documenting flood resistance, understanding the impact of pollution from chicken farming, mapping public park equity, measuring air quality in hair salons. What kind of data are people collecting to make these projects work?
Yeah, so in a lot of our work, because of the distribution of environmental hazards been disproportionately communities of color, low-wealth communities. That's part of environmental justice science, is really understanding and studying trends and patterns in the distribution of environmental phenomena, particularly those that are pollution intensive, pollution emitting uses, right, and their exposure impacts and health impacts. So in many cases, community members are trying to, collect data that documents their everyday experience. So they already have contextual data, right, because their lived experience is data itself. But then on the environmental phenomena side, what are the environmental phenomena that are part of their daily experience? For many folks, that's dealing with air pollution. So we are in the business of helping the communities build hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks. And basically, the problem is a lot of the US EPA US EPA regulatory monitors, they're sparsely located. They're not really located in a lot of the areas that have the most need and the most hazards. In many cases, those sensors may be used, those monitors may be used to measure data, get background kind of regional levels, and it's supposed to be representative of millions of people. Well, if you have a data that's representing hundreds of thousands of millions of people, what about the folks that are actually most impacted, who are most exposed? That data is not representative of their daily exposures, their daily exposure burden. So what we try to do is bring in new sensors and collect more granular data. And so the community groups that we work with, like the South Ward neighborhood, South Ward community in Newark, New Jersey, Kim Gaddy, they're building on a sensor network using Purplewares. We are, which is a sensor that can uses a laser that can give you near real-time levels of particulate matter for the audience. Particulate matter is basically dust in the air. It's measured in microns. So 2.5 microns is 2.5 microns in diameter. That's the stuff that's really bad for your health. It's a major contributor to asthma, stroke, heart disease, cancer, other negative health outcomes. And so we're helping them build these networks, collect particulate matter data in Newark, in South Ward, in Cheverly, Maryland, which has a metal recycling facility, a lot of warehouses, and also a lot of traffic, big truck traffic, and also commuter traffic. And we also have a network in Uniontown, Alabama. We're working with BBC down in Uniontown, Black Bills for Justice, and Black Bill Citizens for Justice. And we're also done some work with the Low Country Alliance for Model Communities in North Charleston, South Carolina, on measuring air quality impacts. They've actually been working with LAMC since 2007, because they're in a port community. So when we think about ports, whether it be airports, seaports, river ports, also dry ports, warehouse complexes are known as dry ports. You can also have intermodal facilities too. We have multiple modes of transportation, transporting goods, right? So there's a lot of pollution emissions associated with those type of activities. So we call that goods movement. So whether it be the Port of Charleston with LAMC, engaging with folks in Savannah too, the Port of Savannah, the folks in Newark and their port as well, trying to do some new work with folks around Baltimore around port issues. A lot of our work is around goods movement in ports, or the movement of goods. And so a lot of air pollution, not just particulate matter. You have volatile organic compounds, you have polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PHs. Some of the VOCs are things like benzene, xylene, toluene, formaldehyde. Think about any fossil fuels when you combust fossil fuels. You have VOCs as that are combustion byproducts. And so that's a big part of this community work, not just our work, but work around the country where folks are trying to understand what type of pollutants they've been exposed to, and looking at exposure differentials and connecting that data to disease relationships too, right? But then trying to say, hey, we have high levels of air pollution. We need to get some more monitoring from our state regulatory agency, and we need to get action. We need to use this data for action. So Miss Margaret Gordon and her work in Oakland with Aclima. Aclima is a company that does mobile monitoring using Google cards. They have like these monitors that can measure very block by block levels of pollution. Or you have folks like folks at George Washington that are doing work around using satellite data. And so getting very granular, kind of hyper-local, high-quality data on air pollution and be able to map that data out. So then that data can be used for decision-making too. So mobile monitor data, satellite data, and then low-cost sensors that can give you more geographic coverage. You see communities trying to get that data. I mean, I could talk on by air, but there's other things too, but I'll stop there.
No, this is fascinating. So tell me a little bit about how you interact with these communities so that you're not doing helicopter science, right? Like, what does it look like? So you're not sort of just harvesting the data from these sensors that are in the community, right? Like, how do they interact with the data? Who controls the data? Who gets to make decisions with the data?
Yeah, I think it's this. I'm gonna answer your question a couple of ways. So there's this whole movement of open science, right? Open data, open science. It sounds great. I think it's a beautiful thing, right? But it's also problematic because there's a lot of ethical issues associated with open science and open data. And for the purpose of communities that I work in, it could be potentially another way of folks have been exploited, because if their data's been shared and they're not getting the solutions, right? And this is the thing, there's so much money in this, I'm gonna say the US research enterprise, billions of dollars every year that goes into universities, specifically universities. I'm gonna focus on taxpayers' dollars. You have taxpayers who have been, poisoned basically by industries, whether it be chicken farms, hog farms, incinerators, chemical plants, highways and byways, petrochemical operations, compressor stations, fracking sites. You can go on and on, refineries, on and on, right? They want their dollars to be used for research for action, right? And so that's part of the ethics. I know you probably have that's a separate question, but it's part of the ethical, the sort of framing, the ethos you have to bring to this work. Now, how do we make sure that you don't have the exploitation? Well, part of it is it's just kind of simple stuff. You have to build relationships with communities, and unfortunately, because the history of extractive science in the U.S. as it relates to folks of color, I'm gonna say Black folks particularly. If you look at Tuskegee, everybody knows Tuskegee, Sisters Project. You have Henrietta Lacks, Hopkins, and taking, her sales and doing all this cancer research and making billions of dollars off of it and really limited benefit to the family. There's the lead study. That's another Hopkins issue, right? And I just don't want to dump on Hopkins. So I'll bring some other examples of in medical science. One of the first heart transplants, I think, was done when an African-American man had an accident. His heart was illegally taken from him for I think, a white male in Virginia. You look at the history of sort of the father gynecology. Who did he do his research on? Enslaved Black women. You look at issues of eugenics in this country, eugenics globally, but eugenics in this country, and the thread, so this stream of eugenics is still kind of pervasive in our medical research. We want to focus on genetics. We want to do reduction of science. We want to talk about what's wrong with you instead of looking at upstream factors. I live in an environment with polluted air. Hey, that's what's wrong. Why don't I have access to safe housing? That's what's wrong. Oh, my water's contaminated. That's what's wrong. No, it's your genes, right? So that history of, and there's other examples too. There's other examples too of medical science exploitation of marginalized groups. That's a major, my point is, there's a major distrust and mistrust. And then you got universities who may have baggage because they're doing research in communities that are nearby. They take their data, they have a class, maybe it's a capstone, or they have a class that goes and collects data all the time. And then the community sees no action. So you have to build relationships. You have to build trust. You have to have some Aretha Franklin. I say respect. People know me. You have to have respect. You have to have trust. Have good communication. The things that make relationships work, great relationships, are the same. Those are the ingredients for great partnerships. You have to have great relationships to have great partnerships. And so if you have if you're doing research, if you're really not doing that work well to really engage these communities and building the relationships, I think that could be, that's a major part of the problem when we're doing work that is not participatory, that's not community driven. So the work has to be participatory. It has to be community driven. The questions have to be from the community. It has to be grounded in community wellness. It has to be grounded in really understand the cultural context. It has to be grounded in value and respecting community cultural knowledge systems. One of the things I can say is, we think about science, and I like to whisper, you don't have to have a PhD to be a scientist. It's the scientific method. But we set up a system in the US where to get federal grants, I'm kind of off subject, but this is relevant, to get federal grants, you have to have a PhD.
Yeah.
To be a PI. That makes no sense. There are plenty of people who are scientists who do not have PhDs. So, if you think about how do you work with communities, my point is bringing it up, is you got to remove the barriers for folks to access science, to be able to apply the science, and also valuing the knowledge that they bring to the science, right? And that, I'll stop there, but those are some of the things that you have to do if you don't want to, have exploitation, building relationships, building partnerships, respecting community cultural knowledge systems, valuing the science that people are doing every day, valuing contextual experts, and valuing scientists who don't have PhDs. Because, these questions of whose knowledge counts, whose questions counts, whose science counts, those are barriers when we are not valuing the knowledge of the questions, the research, the data of folks who are doing science, but who may not be at an academic institution or who may not have a PhD.
Yes, I think that one of the sort of major findings of the PERVADE project has been that questions of power and justice are key concerns for people who are having their data used in data science projects, and too frequently it is having data used, right? Data science is a moniker for extractive data collection in a vast majority, not all cases. And we talked to data scientists who are doing really cool community-based participatory work, but it is rare. And so one of the things we're sort of pushing for is how can data science shift toward a model of not being extractive data collection about people, about data subjects, right? But instead be a questioning of sort of power and relationships around data with communities. And so I think the work you do is a real model for thinking through what the next 10 years of data science should look like. And so, getting as many resources out there as we can for people to sort of say, okay, so on the ground, like, what does that look like? How do we build those community relationships? How do we find those folks who are doing science? Do communities come to you? Do community leaders come to you? Clearly you have lots of, connections now and within various communities, but how did you get there?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I would say early on in my career, and I would say this is a kind of a general statement. Normally how communities who had environmental issues would come to me would be because of the brand recognition of environmental green groups. They would go to green group first, but the green groups are missing a few things. Many of them don't have the research infrastructure. Also, the issues that communities come to them about on environmental justice, they don't have the credibility on those issues. And so the green groups will pass it to me. Oh, we met this group that has this water quality issue or this air quality issue, and they need your help. Now, that's early on, in my career. I would say if I even go back to my training in grad school at UNC Chapel Hill, shout out to the Tar Heels. I was in school of public health. And so one of the projects that I was a part of is the CEEJH project. I don't remember the acronyms. Community Health Effects. Oh yeah, I remember. Community Health Effects of Intensive Hog Operations. So my dissertation is on industrial hog farming. So I work with Dr. Sting Wing. We call him a people's professor. He unfortunately passed away. Now it'll be going on 6 years now, this fall. But he was really an epidemiologist before his time that emphasized, community voice, community power, doing research for the people, doing research for action, making sure the community's voice was at the table at all. He lived CVPR. And so I got training, working with Gary Grant, consensus with Tillery, Naima Muhammad with another community leader, Elsie Herron, who unfortunately passed away, I believe last year, another one of those leaders fighting for environmental justice against, industrial hog farming. And so I learned how to do my initial work, working with communities through my dissertation work with Dr. Wing. So it's already infrastructure that was already there. Now, there was this annual environmental justice conference. One of the oldest environmental justice summits in the country is run by the North Carolina EJ Network, which is one of the oldest statewide environmental justice networks in the country. And I met Omega Wilson, who was dealing with the lack of access to soil water infrastructure in his community in Mebane, I think in 1999. And so I was a student with a couple other students, Dr. Chris Haining, Dr. John Cooper, who's now who does communication work, actually VP of communication at Texas A&M, and Chris is at Hopkins. But we were students, so we came up with a student team to work with Omega to figure out some of the issues in his community. And so I learned how to work on this other issue. So I got grounded in community work and in my training, with Dr. Wing and with Omega. And so I've carried that forward with me throughout my career. But since I've been in Maryland, now to get back to your question, I've been able to expand my network. It's easier for me now to connect the communities than before, where more of the communities know who we are. And part of it is we had a DMV Environmental Justice Coalition that emerged out of an annual EJ symposium that we host. So one of the places where really we're able to meet with advocates, activists, green groups, others, policymakers, others who are interested in environmental justice and health issues in the region was through the symposium. And now we're at the 8th symposium this August. And then out of the 7th symposium, or the 6th symposium, I think the 6th symposium, emerged a 2nd generation of the DMV-EJ Coalition called the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition. So now we have a lot of frontline, fence line groups, and we're growing it. It's not as many as we'd like to have, who are part of that coalition, and we provide technical assistance and research support. When I talk about empowerment science, I'm talking about we do science that serves, right? And so in many ways, if you think about our center as a lab, it's a service, it's a science service lab, okay? And so we're providing science service to community-based organizations that are part of that coalition, that are in the Mid-Atlantic region. And then we have other national networks we're part of. So folks may call, email, say, hey, we need some help on the project. Now, it's sometimes difficult because we can get overextended, provide technical assistance. But a lot of cases when it comes to our partnership work, it's initially a technical assistance project. We may need some help getting the monitor network up and running, or they may need some help with some GIS mapping. And then either that could lead to a longer term partnership, or could just be short term. But a lot of cases, the partnerships that we have now, long-term ones, started out as a technical assistance kind of project.
Fantastic. So yeah, I'm hearing like there's a number of components to this sort of infrastructure for good community-based participatory research, and that includes training and mentorship with folks who know how to do it, who are doing this work already. It includes community groups and nonprofits, right? This whole network of community-based groups that are not academic groups that you can start to talk to and partner with, and then they help make connections
you gotta be connected to the social infrastructure in the communities.
Yes, that's
and be connected to anchor institutions in the communities, and be able to engage with trust agents in the community. So even if you don't have trust, because you may have baggage, you got different kinds of baggage. You got baggage because of your cultural differences. You got baggage because of geographic differences, baggage because of racial ethnic differences. You know, you have to create bridges. So to create bridges because of the baggage that you may bring to it, or because your academic institution hasn't done a great job, or it just has a bad reputation in that community. Because, you know, again, I focus a lot, not just on the communities of color and Black communities, but if you talk specifically about Black communities, it was only a generation ago, how many years ago, 40 some years ago, 50 years ago, we're in 2022, in the 60s, where Black folks were allowed to really go into these major institutions, right? Think about integration. So there's still residual bad blood, bad relationships between the institutions in the host community, particularly in a lot of these urban communities too. So, you know, you have to, again, as I said, you got to have the, what did I say before? I said the trust agents, one level.
Yes.
The anchor institutions. Yes. And then the third one, I forgot the third one, but yeah, those things are important.
Yes. Oh, I love it. So another sort of issue that the PERVADE project has been dealing with is the double-edged sword of data as, you know, a source of new knowledge creation, something that people, you know, it can be exciting, but also a source of vulnerability for people, particularly forms of data like GPS data, but, you know, other forms of, and so I wondered if and how you think about introducing new vulnerabilities in communities when you're asking them to collect data about themselves, about their areas, and if so, how you mitigate those vulnerabilities or think about, you know, reducing them.
I mean, that's a really important question. That's different. So let me see. So we use the word vulnerability. I think it's important. It's a good word to use. Let me respond to it in a couple of ways. So one of the issues that I kind of push back, even though I'm a big proponent of building hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks. So communities are being dumped on. Now they got to do their own monitoring.
Right.
So what's the point of having these government
agencies? Would you
agencies?
do some extra work for us, please? Yes.
So why? So that's a big challenge, and that creates, I won't call it a vulnerability, but I would call it, they already been, so if I break it down for audiences, like the stressors, right? So I'm gonna use the language stressor. So you're already dealing with chemical stressors like lead, mercury, particulate matter. You may be able to deal with biological stressors in your community too. So there's intersectionality between these stressor exposures, okay? You're dealing with mold, mildew, allergens, or SARS-CoV-2, because we know it's disproportionate impact of communities of color. You'll be dealing with physical stressors, heat issues, you know, heat hours, right? Noise pollution. And then you've been dealing with psychosocial stressors. We've seen poverty, violence, you've seen gun violence, psychosocial stressor. So intersectionality of the stressors, right? Now I'm in a community where I'm collecting all this data, and it's the added stress of fighting back, the added stress of collecting that data. Okay, so you're already dealing with toxic stress, and you have to deal with additional stress. So I want to say that. Now, when it comes to certain types of data being collected, there is an issue with confidentiality, privacy, and what's the other word I was going to say? Confidentiality, privacy, and report back. So the ethics report back. So you could be collecting data on air quality, water quality issues, and based on some of the public health laws, for example, if your home is in certain conditions where for example, your septic waste, this is from Mebane, working with Western Valley Association, septic waste is contaminating your well water or is running off of the reservoir, your home could be condemned. So you got to have double blind folks because we want to help them, not have them lose their home. And it's not, and actually, in many cases, it's not their fault that their housing is that condition, because it could be due to environmental racism, the lack of investments and disinvestment that let the infrastructure be poor in the first place. You have that. You have the issue of, report backs, a lot of these cohort studies where people participate in these studies. And I mean, many of y'all may be familiar with this term, the exposome, your total exposure, like exposure to different pathways, different media, built environment, social environment, all these exposures. Okay, and then you give me the data. Now you telling me that I have this kind of loading of chemicals in my fatty tissue in my bone. Okay, what am I supposed to do with that? So there's a report back ethics piece there. Dr. Rachel Lafroche, folks at the Solid Spring Institute, folks like Dr. Ami Zoda have done some work in that area about how you do ethical report back. And it's a huge issue in the work that I do. And it's also, it was mentioned in a chapter, I believe, in Exposure Science in the 21st Century. That was a report that the National Academy of Science helped to write back in 2009, 2011. And we talked about that. That's a big issue. And then it's these new forms of data, the Internet of All Things, we actually had in that report, we talked about ubiquitous monitoring. In many ways, and that was on the more pollution side, but we've already been ubiquitous monitoring. I mean, I'm being monitored right now. Every time I go online and go look at something, I see some movie, something about a comic book movie, because I'm a comic book guy. So, I need maybe turn off some of those things. Right. Yeah. So how do I think that's the type of data, our kind of behaviors are being tracked as relates to as consumers. So I think the ethics, data ethics around that has definitely not kept up with the new forms of data that we produce every day and how it's been extracted, how it's been monetized. A lot of our big data companies, they've done a really good job of monetizing consumer behavior with very few benefits to those consumers. So that's a form of research exploitation that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be more regulatory reform, in my opinion, and more ethical boundaries injected into all the data spaces. So I'll stop there.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I wonder, is this a conversation you have? When does sort of data stop being science and become surveillance, right? Like, and those two things are not, they overlap, right? They're not distinct from each other necessarily. And so I wonder, is this a conversation you have with community leaders about, should we collect particular kinds of data, or what happens if we collect this data? How do we secure it?
Yeah, no, we talk about data agreements. I mean, one of the frameworks that I think is in conflict with open science, open data in some ways is a community owned and managed research framework, which is one of the frameworks that my Omega Wilson I mentioned before. His group were created in response to some exploitation that was happening with some faculty at UNC Chapel Hill. Again, shout out Chapel Hill. It was a bad thing they were trying to do, and so they had to come with their own framework to protect their data. And also to make sure the data was used for action, not just, tenure, promotion, grants, and that kind of thing. People getting, change in their pocket, but not change for the people. And so they were really focused on making sure it was science, what Omega likes to call it, science for compliance, and wanting to move away from guinea pig science. So, one of the things we do is we write MOUs, like this is how the data is going to be used. So we have data sharing agreements. And that sort of commitment to using data in a way that's beneficial community comes from the work with where in many ways, and the MOU's experience come from work with where, and making sure we focus on data sharing agreements that and I'm not saying it has to be just one direction where it's all beneficial to the community, but data sharing agreements that have co-benefits to both the researcher, data scientist / data scientists, and also to the community. So in the sort of like the citizen science parlance, because I talked about community science, I'm also on the board of the Citizen Science Association, and I bring a lot of focus on DEI issues in science to the Citizen Science Association. But citizen science is a huge deal, and you think about traditionally, it's the democratization of science. You got like bird watching, water quality monitoring, et cetera. In many cases, you have a lot of volunteers. You got the N of one or the N of many, right? When you think about citizen science, N of many would be crowd mapping, crowdsourcing. N of one was to be someone out there just collecting water samples or air, temperature readings at their home, right? And so I think, I think there's opportunities for open science for that to kind of work. We have crowdsourced crowd mapping, you map all that data. But then get back to your previous question, what if you're right near a fence line of an industry and they say that you're collecting data? Then that could lead to, and this is real talk for everyone, folks get intimidated. Folks are, industries, I don't want to broad brush all you industry folks out there, but you got colleagues in your sector who may intimidate folks. I know a lot of community leaders who've been intimidated by industry folks, or folks get bought off in the community. And it's all, and that's actually a way to intimidate people too. It's a monetary intimidation because people get bought off and then they won't complain because then they're walking around on eggshells. When I like to call it was it turkeys and trinkets? They give turkeys and trinkets to communities, or turkeys, trinkets, and t-shirts. And we gave t-shirts to the local veterinary school, right? And then folks, we got some t-shirts for the soccer team. They're not gonna say anything. We got some turkeys around Thanksgiving. They're not gonna say anything. We got a couple scholarships for our youth. They're not gonna say anything. So that's a form of intimidation, And so we have to navigate that. And so for me, it's really important to emphasize in the discussion that we have to, whether it be community science or citizen science, that we have to understand the rights that impacted residents have in this space, and to make sure that, we are doing no harm. And so if you're collecting data and you are just, well, Dr. Wilson, I'm just collecting data. Well, if they already been harmed by what's happening with the industries and you do nothing about it, you also part of the problem. And like, that's not being a scientist. No. You can still do great science, but how are you making sure that you're contributing to the solution? So whether it be citizen science or community science, that's an important part of doing this work.
One of the sort of takeaways that we've been developing is that I think part of some of the most egregious uses of data and data science haven't necessarily been because of bad intention, but because using data has become very easy. Getting data has become very easy. And what I think you were pointing out so nicely is that it is good when there's friction in the data gathering process, right? When you need MOUs, when you need to think carefully about like who's collecting the data and why, and who has access to it, and what you're going to do when you have findings from that data, right? Like spending the time, because what you're describing is just a massive amount of work, very clearly, right? And it's not work that's going to get you that paper that's going to get you promoted or whatever, right? It's work that is part of the justice.
That's the thing though. So if you think about the power and justice issue, so we're talking about data justice, right? So we're talking about data justice and how data, who collects data, how data is used, how it's preserved, how it's shared, confidentiality, privacy, these things are important, but universities have a role to play. So the funders first have a role to play. Universities have a role to play too. So, for example, in the community engaged research space. So I'm gonna go back to community-based participatory research. There's plenty of articles for the audience to look up that framework. But one of the things that I pushed back at the University of Maryland, and I think it's gotten better in the 11 years that I've been here, which is part of the problem. When I first got here, I'm up and coming a researcher on the board of Community Campus Partnership for Health, one of the leading international organizations to support the use of CPPR. for, public health research, social justice research, right? The tenure promotion guidelines didn't have metrics for the kind of work that I do, right? For basically half the work that I do. So I actually, when I got here, I was like, okay, I mean, I'm on this board as organization. We actually created tenure promotion guidelines in 2009 that y'all could adapt. And it took years, literally years, for the university to catch up with other universities already doing. Even though we're a land-grant institution, we're supposed to have a service mission. Right. Even though we have a school of public health. And one of the core things of public health is serving the public, duh, right? And also we do a lot of community engaged work. So how you have a school of public health that does community engaged work and you actually don't have metrics on the books to actually evaluate that work? Like public health practice or applied research, solutions research, highly problematic. So I would say during my time going for tenure, assistant associate, half my work was encountered here in Maryland. There was some issues there. I won't go into that story, but that happened. And when I went for full, just recently got full, still not a lot of metrics. Better than my first go with assistant associate. Now, I was going to say, to add to that, now we have a lot of institutions that are talking about they want to be anti-racist and focus on DEI. You can bring those metrics into the tenure promotion guidelines, and that will help change the culture of the type of work that's valued, right? Because you have a valuation system that doesn't value this work. Of course, you're going to have people who are not going to do it, who want to do it. Of course, you're not going to have departments and schools that are tenuring and promoting people. And so you got to change the culture, but you got to get it on paper, and you have to have the appropriate metrics, and you have to have people committed to anti-racism, committed to social justice, committed to DEI at the department level, at the school level, and in your tenure promotion guidelines. So it's possible and we got to see that kind of cultural change. And we've seen some shifts at Maryland. I think hopefully we'll see some more shifts under the new president. For example, the University of Maryland. But there's other institutions too where they're talking about DEI, they're talking about anti-racism, they're talking about social justice. Well, you can't just talk about it, you have to be about it. And part of being about it has to be in your guidelines, tenure promotion guidelines. And also in the granting agencies, you have the whole Unite program, which is this kind of getting rid of structural racism and NIH funding. Okay, thank you, that's a good start. But you got a history of inequities in your funding and a lack of grants going to faculty of color from underrepresented groups in the sciences. And that's a lot of work that's being done at the federal level too when it comes to funding. And if the funders change or help change the culture, that can help change the culture at the universities who are seeking that funding.
I keep getting excited to ask my next question and forgetting to say, for the audience, the question and answer feature is open. You may add questions to it at any time, and I will relay those questions to Sacoby. This is really exciting. So please feel free to keep asking questions.
Just for everybody, it's Sacoby. I know you said it a few times. It's actually Sacoby. You're fine.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. Go ahead.
And I misidentified you as an associate professor. Congratulations on your promotion.
That's fine. It won't be official. I mean, it's in my signature. It won't be official till August, but it's fine.
Well, that's wonderful news.
Yeah, thank you.
What's coming next on the community data ethics horizon? What are the issues that we should be thinking about that we haven't talked about yet today?
These are really, really important issues. I believe, there's a lot. There's a lot. Because as I said, I think the new data, the ways we collect data have outpaced our ethical kind of infrastructure and regulatory kind of bounds, right? And I'm not saying we're in a wild, wild west of data collection, but you have so many new data companies that are popping up, and so many ways that data has been exploited. Consumer data has been tracked and monetized. I mean, the monetization is so problematic in my opinion, and more needs to be done in those spaces because we have a capitalistic kind of framework that's been applied to this data, and I think there are a lot of people who are losing out because we don't have a good sort of ethical frame that's being used across sectors. In some sectors, like for example, even though I critique the EPA and some of the environmental regulations, that's more advanced than some of these other data issues that folks have been dealing with. And then you have the whole disinformation issues. And so how data is not really real data, or it's like, a little bit of data can lead to a half truth or, misstatement or fault, so more, and then this information realm and more needs to be done there. But I would say, kind of getting back to some of the work that I do, I do have some funding from the Bezos Earth Fund and through that data collaborative. And so we're having these type of discussions about, how do you work with communities, how you bring in, data scientists, data companies, how you deal with ethics. We're talking about, a lot of these issues, and we're talking about some of these same issues with the Citizen Science Association. One of my colleagues, Dr. Karen Cooper, who's at NC State, their university has actually been designated as a citizen science institution. I'm not sure what that means, but I think it sounds like a good thing. But she got funding, and with some other colleagues from, I think, NC State and other institutions, got funding from NSF to look at data ethics with citizen science. And they're coming out with a citizen science data ethics toolkit. So that's something that could be looked to. I think could be a resource for folks who are in more like the citizen science space.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when it's going to be released. And I think she's also, Dr. Cooper is doing some great work. I think she's also done some other ethics related research around engaging communities of color, engaging marginalized groups. She's also working with historically Black colleges in North Carolina. As part of the data collaborative, I believe they're part of the collaborative is trying to engage a lot of our MSI institutions. I might use the term, I'll use the term for the purposes of our discussion, minority service institutions. So trying to engage historically Black colleges. I believe part of the frontiers relates to data science is trying to engage more of our academic infrastructure beyond our primarily white institutions, or particularly ones that are heavily funded, and trying to build out the data science infrastructure of our historically Black colleges, our tribal colleges, our AEPI colleges, our Hispanic Latino serving institutions, right? I think just to have an equal playing field, and that gets back to the point of the DEI issues, the diversity, equity, inclusion issues, or even when called use a JEDI. We use JEDI with Citizen Science Associates. So the JEDI issues, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. I think there's some justice issues that are very important there. It's related to who's doing the work and making sure that other types of institutions are doing the work. Another issue I believe that's on the horizon is this data repositories, data hubs, and how those data hubs are being built, who has access to those data hubs. And then also, as I said before, the whole modernization of data, I think is important. And then even when you think about in public health or even in medicine, we have personalized medicine. So people's, individual data, how that's used for individualized medicine, for personalized medicine. I think that's on the horizon, on the frontier. I believe NIH has a program called All of Us, where they're trying to do more and getting people engaged in research and kind of bringing like a citizen science kind of crowdsourcing frame. I believe I may be incorrect. So whoever with All of Us, you can push back, hey, that's not right. But that's another program to look to that has some potential good stuff and some potential challenges, right? So those are a few things that are on my mind. But I also think, when it comes to this new administration and it comes to environmental issues, I'll get back to that. There are a lot of executive orders and efforts to address communities that have been historically impacted by environmental climate injustices. There's a lot of money out there that's going to be invested through the infrastructure bill, right? And so we need data to, as I like to say, identify, prioritize, and micro-target communities with those investments and getting the right data. So having mapping tools is a big issue right now with screening tools to be able to screen the map, visualize communities with these issues. And then making sure you have really good data as indicators for the indicators in those tools, because a lot of the data, as I talk about air quality, is really bad data. So I like to say bad data in, bad policy out. So getting better data so we can, again, identify, prioritize, and micro-targeted communities that have the most need, getting the best health data, the best air quality data, the best soil quality data, the best water quality data, the best data on energy use. These things are important. And so there's a lot of data needs there in the environmental space.
One of the things you've really emphasized that I think is particularly important is that citizen science or community based science is about data for action, not just data for knowledge, but data for action. And how do you talk to your students about making that connection and what to do with data in concert with communities once you have it, once you understand it, once you have the map, right? Then what?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the sort of I think the critical literacy that's involved. So we report the data back in the form that's usable, understandable. I think I just did, was it last week? No, last week, I just participated in a workshop on science communication for National Academy of Sciences. And so really important about how you communicate science and scientific data, to the people, and understanding the ways of knowing, the ways of understanding, and basically understanding your audience. And that's part of it. But yeah, so we do community workshops. We do a lot of community trainings. I mean, like community science, because we can train community members to understand science and use scientific data and use it for advocacy. So we have projects with the National Wildlife Federation. We have a project where we've done some workshops and trainings around air quality, goods movement issues. Through some of the work that we're doing, the Environmental Defense Fund, they provide some funding so we can build out one of our apps. It's a block assessment app, which allows folks to collect their own block level data. And so that can help increase their critical literacy and be able to use this data for action. So that's important. It's through some of the work with the Bezos Earth Fund funding that we received. We're engaging faith-based groups like the AME Church, United Church of Christ, and then again, building out these relationships, building community science training programs. So I think these community science programs allow folks to not just get knowledge, raise awareness, but also increase their skills and their critical literacy on these issues so they can have more agency to act. So that's a big part of this. So getting the right form that they can understand and increasing their capacity to act. So again, it's important to build capacity and then maintain that capacity to act.
Fantastic. This just really illustrates the whole ecosystem that has to exist around data to use it well and justly, right? It's a whole set of skills, it's a whole set of relationships and people and infrastructures for the data. So it's just fascinating to think about sort of all those pieces and how to help, you've clearly just developed such a ton of resources. If you think about resources as not just, MOUs, right? But also the ability to do things and to know, who to talk to and how. And so like one of the things that I hope will come for people who watch this in the future is, thinking about, okay, how do I build those resources in my space, right? Or in my lab or at my university. And so, if you had sort of final, well, and it won't be final because we have Q&As coming in, but, pieces of advice for people who want to build out those resources, where would they start?
Yeah, one of the places to go to, like I said, the Citizen Science Association has some resources. Dr. Cooper's toolkit, which I'm not sure if it's, I thought she released it. Well, it's not just her, it's a team of folks who are also members of, or actually former board members with me of the Citizen Science Association. That's a resource. I think one of the great resources is Community Campus Partnerships for Health, CEEJH, has a lot of resources for folks who want to get engaged in this work. And be able to do, ethical, work with community groups. There's some service learning organizations out there. It's related, but it's different. And the reason I want to highlight that, you can even build so I'm not saying you cannot have students do this work. And it's important for students to learn. So, for example, in my courses that I teach, I usually have a project for the students to work with a community partner and to make sure that there's deliverables that have been delivered to that community partner. So it's just not just the students are learning, but there's something we leave behind. So it helps to leave a tool, leave a resource, leave a guide, leave something that they can help address the problem. And we just started a summer scholars program this started on Monday. And so as part of the summer scholars are going to be working on projects this summer. And most of those projects have a community engaged component to them. Right. So that's another way through your courses. And then you have federal agencies that are doing work. There's funding opportunities out there for this kind of work. EPA has funding opportunities, NSF has funding opportunities. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has a Partnerships Environmental Public Health Tracking Program. Environmental, I'm mixing up two things. Partnerships Environmental Public Health, PEPH. They also have resources. And then you have professional organizations, I already mentioned Citizen Science Association, American Public Health Association. Then you also have foundations that are getting more engaged in, like, even I think MacArthur, not on the data science side, I'm not sure they connect to the ethical community engagement side. But you got MacArthur, and you have other foundations that are trying to connect both the data and the engagement together. So lots of stuff out there.
We had a question come in from Saguna Shakar, that I think we anticipated, but I want to signal boost her question because she's also working in this area. So thank you for the energy and years of inspiring work that you've shared. I've been working on creating a resource to support community partners and academic partners to negotiate their use of data. This sounds so useful in the context of research and services with immigrant and refugee communities. And so might you recommend any resources that come to mind on data practices in partnership to support more equitable and less extractive relationships, or resources that you think should be created?
Yeah, I would say that I believe one of my colleagues Citizen Science Association, I think we're trying to do some, as I said, some work in this space. So I would say that toolkit that Dr. Cooper and the larger team created may be a resource for you as well. And also community campus partnerships with health. I think those will be two places to start.
Fantastic. Well, anything that we haven't touched on today that you want to make sure we get into the conversation?
No, I think I covered a lot. I believe that, going back to the last question, there are populations that, may be living in vulnerable conditions. I use that term because I was at a meeting recently, and I like the framing. We kind of use some words that make it like vulnerabilities are intrinsic, vulnerabilities are extrinsic. So instead of saying vulnerable populations, vulnerable conditions. So we have populations who may be living in vulnerable conditions. Things are, economic vulnerabilities, social vulnerabilities that we need to pay special attention to. And I would say that, the work in environmental justice provides some insight into how to navigate and work with those communities. And I think some of the same ethos and ethical practices that comes to work on communities with EJ issues, I think are applicable to folks who are maybe climate refugees, right, or other types of refugees, folks who may be living immigrant communities who are dealing with pollution issues, or maybe are coming from war-torn areas, folks who are maybe prison, who've been trying to navigate sort of the prison industrial complex, so maybe been in the system and coming back into communities. And so there's different ways to work with those communities. But I think the focus on relationship building, understanding context, and doing science that serves is really, really important. How can we make sure we do no harm in doing science that serves?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We will be posting this on our website, and we will track down some of those resources as well and provide links because they sound just fantastic. Thank you for spending this time with us, for answering these questions. There are some kudos in the Q&A coming in. People really enjoyed hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me today.
And thanks for the audience too. Thanks all. Cool.